So the other day, I was meeting with Luke Burasa and Matt Ing. I had to meet up with Matt Ing afterwards, and so Matt Ing, who leads the GOC at UCLA, came up, and I introduced him to Luke. I said, yeah, Luke's been going to Valley, and Matt just goes, oh, cool, when does your album come out? Just because everyone at Valley, like we have all these talented musicians and human beings in all sorts of fields, and Luke's like, June 14th, and he's like, you really have an album. It was kind of cool. We're so blessed to have so many gifted people, and what Joey's saying about like Valley's a really special thing, enjoy it while it's here, kind of sounded ominous, I'm not gonna lie. It's like what's coming down the pike, that we don't know. It's not, like we're not planning to like dismember, is that the word? Disband. Dismember is kind of brutal. We're not planning to disband Valley. But I do know what he means in like, this is like an epoch of your life that is really special. These moments, retreat weekends, thrift stores, Abby's Coffee, all that. So to be aware of it and to enjoy it. And here we come tonight to our last sermon in Genesis, and we're only in Genesis chapter 11, because that was the goal this semester, to go through 1 through 11, because the rest of Genesis, that's where there's this division in the story. And the rest of Genesis through chapter 12 through chapter 50 tells the story of 4 patriarchs, fathers of the faith, beginning with Abraham. But Genesis 1 through 11 is a really cool section of the scriptures that gives the history of humanity. And it lays the foundation. It's Moses writing this, just pouring concrete into the foundation of humanity. And it explains who we are and why we are. And so I wanted to go through those chapters because they're so pivotal in your understanding and engagement of the world. So I hope, even though we've kind of gone through it quick, like last week we did 5 chapters, whereas we did 3 sermons in chapter 2, I hope it's given you a lens through which you'll see the world for the rest of your life. And then maybe kind of given you some clues on how to study it so you can come back to Genesis. And there was, Ken Ham gave a little speech at the Masters University a few months ago. And who was there for that? Any of you there for that? Cool, nobody. Oh, Springer. Hey, what's up? Lex was there, okay. He had like some catchy little phrase he gave where he basically said, he had everybody speak it back, and it was basically like, the answer is in Genesis 1 through 11, and he'd say, let's talk about abortion, and the answer is in Genesis 1 through 11. Let's talk about sexual ethics, answers, and let's talk about murder, and he went through all these things, and he was trying to make the point to you guys, even though none of you were there, that all of the issues of today go back to the start. So that's been our goal. So we come to chapter 11 tonight, and guess what? Good news. We're not even going to get through the whole chapter, because halfway through the chapter starts a genealogy that flows into chapter 12. So we're actually just going to end our study in verse 9 of chapter 11. So let's read Genesis 11, 1 through 9, and then I will jump into this little sermon I've prepared for you. Okay, start my clock so I don't torture you. Genesis 11, verse 1. Actually, we're going to start in verse 32 of chapter 10. These are the clans of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. This chapter, well, there's a lot here. This is a wrestling match between God and man. And speaking of that wrestling match, just this week I've heard a few things about man's wrestling with God. I was listening to the Lex Friedman podcast again. Yeah. And he ended the episode, he was talking to Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. And he always leaves the podcast after the 6.5-hour conversation or whatever with a quote. And this is the quote that Lex ended this conversation about AI, the exploration into the unknown and the divine, where we can actually reproduce intelligence. And the quote is from Arthur C. Clarke, and it's this: "It may be that our role on this planet is not to worship God, but to create him." Now, we see this sentiment all over the place, from an author like Clarke to a pop cultural icon like Post Malone, who says in one of his songs that obviously none of you are familiar with, "I thought I was strong enough, I threw my bottle at the sky and said, 'God, that's a warning.'" It's a funny picture from Post, right? Throwing his bottle of liquor at the sky and saying, "I'm warning you, God." To Kanye West saying he's rejecting Christianity because, why? Because I am God. Or to a preacher like Stephen Furtick saying, "Whatever God is, you are." We see this boasting all over the place, from the hallowed halls of scholarship to pop culture in the music kids are listening to, kids these days. And really, this raging of man against God is the continuation of the story that began in Genesis 3:1, where that old serpent slithered into the garden and enticed Eve to grasp at godness. You can be like God. Just eat. Now, she should have said, "Well, so then why don't you eat so that you'll be like God?" She didn't think that far. From Genesis 3, it's been the story of mankind. It continued in King David's day when he wrote Psalm 2, that the nations rage against God as they plot to overtake him. David penned these words: "The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed." Man against God. It's the story of human history. God versus man. God's name versus man's name. Making much of God versus making much of man. It's the questions of, are we made in the image of God, or are we gods? Are we designed to mirror God for his glory, or to manufacture God for our glory? Are we the made, or are we the maker, the creature or creator? And it's honestly the daily battle of humanity. It expresses itself in all sorts of ways that maybe we're not even aware of, in the sense of like putting it into that category today. But all these issues of sexual ethics come down to this: the God who designed me, there is no designer. I am who I want to be. I will be designed and fashioned according to my will. Questions of euthanasia. Is life and death in the power or in the hand of God? Or do we have the power over life and death? Questions of abortion. All of these modern issues that we're grappling with come down to God versus man, creator versus creature. And so these issues of today are not new. They began in Genesis chapter 3. And what does that have to do with Genesis chapter 11? Well, it has everything to do with the story of humanity building a tower at Babel. On display in this chapter is mankind flexing their muscles at God, attempting to overtake him. Now, so we'll see the flex of man, but then we're going to see the response of God. And it's God's response, if we've been paying attention through 11 chapters, is almost a broken record at this point. It's just mercy and grace. Just more mercy and grace. And that's who our God is. He perpetually, incessantly responds to our rebellion like the waves crashing upon the shoreline, mercy and grace. You know, next time you're at the beach or you're at the beach this summer and you see the waves and you have that reflective moment where you pause and you put down your cell phone for 3 minutes and just think of each wave that hits mercy. And the next one, grace. Mercy and grace. Because that's God's response to human pride. And we're going to see it on display. Mercy, not giving them what they deserve. Grace, giving them what they don't deserve. And we're going to see that here in Genesis chapter 11. Okay, let me give you a little bit of context here. In chapter 10, we come out of a list of a bunch of names. It's called the Table of Nations, and there's 70 names that are descendants of Noah. And that number 70 is intentional. It's representative of totality. So the whole world is coming into focus here. The world was destroyed except for 8 in the ark. Those 8 come out. And then historically, we document the people that come after them. And I said last week that should give some veracity to Scripture, some integrity to this document. This is a document. This is a historical document, and it's telling the tale of humanity. Anyway, that should, equips you for that silly argument of, it's just a book written by a couple guys. No. This is historical, and it's documentation. And so in chapter 10, you see the spreading of humanity. Now, look at chapter 10, verse 5, because I'm going to answer a little possible objection that you might have. From these coastlands, people spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans in their nations. The sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. And then you see these nations mentioned. And so an observant reader could go, wait a second, in chapter 11, verse 1, the whole earth had one language in the same words. But in chapter 10, verse 5, it says they each had their own. There's 70 plus languages in chapter 10. And the explanation of that is simple. This is ordered thematically, not chronologically. Chapter 10 is telling us the story of humanity from the ark. And then kind of like Genesis 1 and chapter 2, chapter 2 of Genesis goes back into a moment in chapter 1 and zooms in and tells the story of the creation of man in more detail. Chapter 11 goes back to chapter 10 and zooms in before the dispersion in all the languages and tells the story of humanity that's about to happen. And this is actually a brilliant little move from Moses. I love the insights into the authorship because it shows you the intentionality of the authors. What Moses is doing by putting chapter 10 and the scattering of all these humans all over the world before chapter 11 is he's giving us the end of the story before we read it so that in our minds we know they don't win. Like humanity doesn't win here. They're going to be one singular, one language. Well, we just read about how they're scattered with 70 languages. So clearly they didn't win. What happened? And then chapter 11 tells us what happened. So that's kind of cool. Okay, there's some structure to this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but there's a chiastic structure to these opening 9 verses, which is kind of cool. I'm going to point it out really quickly, but if you don't follow, don't worry. But a chiasm is a literary device to emphasize the heart of a story. And Hebrew poets and authors would do this often. It points you to the focal point of the story by structuring similarities like parallelisms to get you to the the tip of the spear. And this is the structure, chiastic structure. Look in verse 1. Look at the similar language that happens here. Verse 1 of chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language. And then go to verse 9. So this is the start of the chiasm, and the bottom, the Lord confused the language of the earth. So it starts one language, many languages. Then in verse 2, the people went to Shinar and settled there. And then if you look in verse 8, this is a second degree, closing in on our point. The Lord dispersed them from there. So they settled there, they got dispersed from there. In verse 3, they said to one another. In verse 7, notice the second line. God says, I don't want them to understand one another. So they understand each other, now they don't. In verse 4, they say, or in verse 3 again, come, let us make bricks. In verse 7, God says to himself, come, let us go down. In verse 4, come, let us build. Verse 5, 3 lines down, God mentions the city that they had built. And we're narrowing in. Here's the last couple in verse 4. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower. And in verse 5, God looked down at the city and the tower. Now here, do you see that structure? It's very similar. Here's the focal point, and the point of the whole message is right there in verse 5. The Lord came down. Okay, now you go, why are you telling me this? Because this literally is making this point. It's saying that man built itself up to God. And so this chiasm is building this structure. They got together. They settled there. They spoke to each other. They decided. They had a plan. They built a city, and they build themselves up to God. And the focal point and the turn of the story is God comes down. And then every single step that they went up descends down from there. God confuses their language, breaks down their city, scatters them in the earth. And so it's this perfect emphasis, and it all hinges on that moment when God descends to man. Do you see that? Some of you are like, cool. Others are like, what? Okay. The point of the story is man builds itself up to overtake God. God comes down and overtakes man. I mentioned Psalm chapter 2 at the start, the nations rage. Genesis 11 is a beautiful exposition in a sense of Psalm 2. The nations plot together. We see that plotting. And the Lord in heaven, what does he do? He looks down and laughs. Okay. How'd that go? Okay. Here's the structure that we're going to look at these 9 verses, okay? I have 3 points, Lex. Point number 1, conceit, the story of humanity. That's verses 1 through 4. Conceit, the story of humanity. Compassion, the character of God. It's verses 5 and 6. Point 3, correction. The salvation from heaven. Verses 7, 8, 9. So we have conceit, compassion, correction. Point number 1, conceit. Verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let's make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Here we see the continuation of the building and advancement of society. A city is built. We saw the first city in chapter 4, but here another city is being built. They build a skyscraper in the midst of the city, a ziggurat, and they want to make a name for themselves so that they're not dispersed. Now, what's the problem here? Is the Bible, against technological advance? Not at all. Architectural structures are not inherently godly or ungodly. You have a 3-story home, good for you. It's not too high in the sky. What am I talking about? California, 3-story homes. But there are underlying issues here. And I want to show you those in verse 4. There's 4 determinations made by humanity. And the first 2 are the outward display of the second 2, which is an inward disposition. Look at verse 4. Let us build ourselves a city. We are not going to spread out. We're going to stay together, and we're going to build. And within the city, a tower with its top in the heavens. They want to reach God. They want to climb the stairs to heaven. And like Adam and Eve, they thought they could, which gives away that they really had no understanding of God. They had a God of their imagination. They had a God that was localized. They had a God that was actually attainable. Eve really thought that by eating a piece of fruit, she would be like God. And people really thought that by building a tower, a really tall tower, we can reach to the heavens. Now, these are outward manifestations of an inward disposition, and look at what is said next. Let us make a name for ourselves. Now, that's a reflection of them wanting to build a city. They wanted to have fame. Now, God shows us in chapters 1 and 2 that he had made us in the image of God. Our very purpose to exist is to make him famous, to be a reflection of his glory. But here, mankind says, we want to make ourselves famous. Man turns inward and becomes obsessed with themselves, obsessed with legacy and afraid of anonymity. We want to be known. We want to be famous. Now, a little diagnosis of what's going on in their heart here. This is the sin of craving human praise, desiring human praise. I want to be famous. And that sin is a damnable sin that has kept millions out of the gates of heaven. Do you remember Jesus saying to the religious leaders in John 5:44, you cannot come to me that you would have life. You can't be saved because you desire the praise that comes from man and not the glory that comes from God. You can't be saved. Insofar as you crave the worship of man for yourself, you can't have Christ. And that was the self-obsession we see here. Let us be famous. Now, not a single one of you sitting here or this guy standing here is immune to this. How many of our daily actions are motivated by a desire for praise from others? The second underlying motivation is lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Let's band together, people. Now, you might go, what's so wrong with that? Well, go back to chapter 1 and look in verse 27. At the creation of man, he creates them in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, and God blessed them. And the first thing God says to them is what? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Disband. Go to the ends of the earth. And he repeats it repeatedly. Chapter 9, verse 1. After the flood, he tells Noah and his sons, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Go, do not band together, go forth. And so if you want to diagnose the sin issue of their hearts here, this is how I put it: security and safety outside of obedience to God. No, that's not safe. We're going to band together, and this is how we're going to be secure. We're going to stick together. We're not going to obey God. Security and safety outside of obedience. Again, we're guilty. How often are we pursuing security in the foundation of man-made things? So, conceit. Mankind defies God, his basic command for humanity, and actually thinks, if we stay here, we can build ourselves up. It's the same delusion that Eve had when she said, I eat that pomegranate and I'll be God. They're good. Pomegranates are good. They're not going to make you God. It's delusional. Now, in response to this, we see God's compassion. We see the character of God in verses 5 and 6. The Lord God came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people. They all have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do now will be impossible for them. Okay. That's interesting language, isn't it? It could sound a little bit like God's afraid. I mean, look at what he says. Oh man, they all have one language? This is only the start. Nothing they propose to do will be impossible. Is God intimidated? Is God a little bit worried? Like, yikes, I don't want them to realize how powerful they are. Some would say that. God is afraid. That's what Satan said to Eve. Oh, no. God knows if you eat, you'll be just like him. He's afraid. He's in heaven cowering. Don't eat the fruit, Eve. Don't eat the fruit. Don't eat the fruit. I don't want you to be equal to me. I mean, she was made out of a rib from a dude that came from dirt, talking to a snake, and God's afraid, intimidated. God's not afraid. And how we see that is very intentional in this language of verse 5. And the Lord came down to see. Mankind, in all of their power and technological advance, had put clay and baked it in the sun, which God was shining, and they built a big tower. And they're going, wow, look at this tower. And God says, oh man, they're building a tower. Let me come down and see the tower. Oh, look, there's a tower. Look at that tower. God, the language is intentional. He's having to come down through the clouds and through the galaxies and the Milky Way, and he's not a candy bar, it's our galaxy, and he's coming down and he's having to go, oh, look down there, a little tower. Like you looking at an ant. Felicity and I were taking a walk the other day, and there was a long line of ants. And so we just sat there for 10 minutes and just watched these ants. And she's like, where are the baby ants? And asking all these questions. And we're having to go down and look at these ants. Like God comes down and goes, oh, look, a tower. They built a tower. Just the description of what's happening here. It's Psalm 2. He looks and laughs. The nations are plotting together. How will we destroy God and his anointed one? And he's laughing. You think you're going to win? I've set my king on my hill. I win. You don't win. I win. And God comes down. What are they doing down there? So what do we make of his assessment, though? They'll be able to do anything. This is what we make of it. He cares. He cares about humanity and our plight. His trouble was not for his own position. He wasn't like, the starting player on the team, and then that new signing comes in, and you're like, oh no, I'm not going to start anymore, no. Like some of you are nervous about this weekend, like pickleball, like when you saw like Jake and Bella are team, oh my goodness, like we're going to lose. God was concerned with what would happen to humanity. In their God delusion, they would build clay bricks and bitumen and make mortar. Think of that scene. Just think of that scene, how descriptive Moses is. Think of how sweaty and tired they were. More bricks, passing the bricks up. And how they'd have to stop and get water because they're dehydrated. And they're sore in the morning. Oh, we have to keep building. I just think of how human this was, right? Sweating in the sun. Laughable. We're going to reach God. Oh, I need more water. And God sees it, and in typical Godness, he shows pity. I like what one man said. He wrote this. God was troubled by what would happen to humanity if the human family was left unchecked. They would build up a delusion of self-sufficiency through their false religion, corporate security, and political uniformity. They would throw off God and attempt to rule the universe. And in their delusion, they would never turn to God, and their hearts would become impenetrable and irredeemable. God cares about their well-being, and he cares about your well-being and mine. He cares for his creation. And here's the obvious, but it must be said, it is not good for you and me to grasp at godness. It is not good for us to become the center of worship and the center of the universe and actually believe the delusional lie that I can be like God. It's for our interest that God comes down and says, oh no. And we see this all over the place, don't we? 2 words, child actor. Take a kid, throw him into the spotlight and say, everywhere you go, you're worshiped, and here's all the money. And how do they turn out? We are not made to be worshiped. When we are, we implode. And this is a basic lesson in idolatry. Anything, this is for you and me, anything that is not God, that you put in the place of God, you will destroy. You put yourself in the place of God, you'll destroy yourself. You put sex in the place of God and worship it, you will destroy it. What was designed to be a gift to satisfy and delight you will become what we label now a sexual addiction, fraught with devastation and disease and ripped apart relationships and broken hearts. Because we worship it, it wasn't designed to be worshiped. How many families have been ripped apart by a love of money, where the father is so obsessed with getting more and more and more, and he gets his kids another big screen and a bigger house, but doesn't love them and care for them, and all they want is for their dad to be home, but he's obsessed with more. How many nations have been ravaged by the bloodlust of power from rulers who just demand more and more because they worship control. These things were never meant to be God. Fame was never meant to be supreme. Money and legacy and power and sex. Once we remove God and put those things in his place, we inevitably destroy those things and ourselves because we weren't designed to be worshiped. None of those things, nothing in this world was designed to bear up the weight of godness. Only God. And when God is in his rightful place, all of those things fall into line and become delightful gifts. What a gift money is. You have money? Awesome. Use it. Use it for good. Use it to help others. You have control. You have power. Excellent. Use it to serve the less fortunate. Sex, what a beautiful gift sex is for a husband and a wife in the covenant relationship of marriage. But how quickly those things are destroyed when they become God. And I know you've all got your own stories of how those gods have devastated your lives. They were not meant to be. And so God looks down at this human heart that is perpetually creating idols, as John Calvin said, and he has pity and compassion. And so in his compassion, he determines to correct it. So in verses 7 and 9, we see the correction, the salvation from heaven. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. God comes down, he confuses them, and he scatters them. Project dismantled and abandoned. And what they feared the most came upon them. And this is not the action of an insecure God threatened, so he breaks apart the party. This, my friends, was his mercy and his grace. God came down to rescue man from man. Now, let me prove this to you. We all know this story as the Tower of Babel, right? Anybody say Babel? No, because that's weird. We're not English. It's Babel. Now, I've been saying Babel this whole time. What you may or may not know is that's the Hebrew word Bavel. It's the same word every time you see in the Old Testament for Babylon. So why do we translate it as Babel here and Babylon elsewhere? Well, there's a couple reasons, but one of them is it's a play on the word Babel, which in English is a babbling tongue. And that's what happens. God makes man babbling fools. In their pride, they said, we will be united. And so he disperses them and their language, and they become babbling fools. And so you can imagine the moment this happened. I mean, one man said it was like this. It's like you're watching a movie, and then you're watching it with subtitles, and then all of a sudden the subtitles stop working. And you go, what in the world is going on? They're all of a sudden building, and all of a sudden different languages. They don't understand one another. They can't communicate. So they become these babbling fools. God made them as such. So we like to keep the word Babel because it sounds like babbling. But actually, this is Babylon. They settled in Babylon. And you're familiar with Babylon. Throughout the Bible, it's a sign of human pride and arrogance and rebellion against God, isn't it? It's the hub of rebellion. In Zechariah chapter 5, we encounter a woman who's on her way to Shinar. Well, look at verse 1 or 2. The people migrated from the east. They found a plain in the land of Shinar. And this woman in Zechariah chapter 5 is going to Shinar to build herself a temple, which stands in competition to the house of God. And that is what the epitome of Babylon is. It tries to compete with God. And so this woman is going to build a house where she will worship outside of the temple of God. And Babylon, all throughout Scripture, represents a place of immorality and materialism, the physical, carnal lusts satiated, opposed to God. Now, I want you to turn quickly to Daniel chapter 4. I want to show you this in vivid detail. Daniel is somewhere in the Old Testament, so just flip through there until you find it. And you might be familiar with this story, the story of Nebuchadnezzar. Remember Nebuchadnezzar, that king? Look in Daniel chapter 4 and beginning in verse 28. He's having all these dreams. One night, Nebuchadnezzar, verse 29, is walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babel. He's in Babel. He's in Babylon. And the king answered and said, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power, as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" Sounds like Genesis 11, doesn't it? While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among man, scattered. And your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. That's Genesis 11. Look at this paradise and this power for my majesty that I have built. Look how great I am. Nebuchadnezzar standing on the rooftop saying, I am God. And God, before the words could even finish out of his mouth, goes, no, Nebuchadnezzar, I'm God. Stop grasping at godness. Now, notice the story's not over, but I can tell you this isn't coming from a place of insecurity with Yahweh. Oh no, Nebuchadnezzar, he's going to overtake me. Did you notice what he said? Look back at verse 32. You're going to become like an ox until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men. Nebuchadnezzar, you are going to be scattered and a babbling fool walking on all fours, eating grass like a beast until you know that you are not God, I am God. And you say, wow, what a malevolent God who's insecure and nervous in heaven, pacing because Nebuchadnezzar's greatness. No, my friend. What a grace-filled, merciful God who humbles Nebuchadnezzar in order to rescue Nebuchadnezzar from himself. Look what happens next. Verse 34. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, he's writing this, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. And then some of the most beautiful words of worship. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? A declaration that God is God, and I am not. And thus Nebuchadnezzar is rescued from the Babylon of his heart. Friends, God is seeking to save us from our grasping at godness. And he uses confusion and dismantling our arrogant projects to do it. It's mercy. He's not threatened. He's gracious. Now, of course, if you remain in Babylon and you don't renounce it like King Nebuchadnezzar did, well, you can read about that in Revelation 14, in Revelation 18. Fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird. And you see God destroy it. And so the headline is coming in the future, Babylon falls, the Lamb wins. Babylon will not win this war. They don't win in Genesis 11. They don't win in Genesis 3. They don't win in Psalm 2. Nebuchadnezzar didn't get close, and neither will you. As long as you live in the city of my majesty and my greatness and flex your muscles at God, you're not going to win. But God is gracious. In 1927, James Weldon Johnson was an author and a civil rights activist, and he wrote a book of sermons called God's Trombones. The third sermon was a poetic kind of sermon called The Prodigal Son. And he writes this poem about the prodigal son leaving and the self-righteous son staying. And I want to read you this poem. A very famous line comes out of it, how the poem starts. Listen to how it starts. Young man, your arms are too short to box with God. And then he goes on to tell the story of the prodigal. I think it's worth hearing. Listen to this. Jesus spoke in a parable and said, a certain man had 2 sons. Jesus didn't give this man a name, but his name is God Almighty. And Jesus didn't call these sons by name, but every young man everywhere is one of these 2 sons. And the younger son said to his father, he said, Father, divide up the property and give me my portion now. And the father, with tears in his eyes, said, Son, don't leave your father's house. But the boy was stubborn in his head and haughty in his heart, and he took his share of his father's goods and went into a far-off country. There comes a time, when every young man looks out from his father's house, longing for that far-off country. And the young man journeyed on his way, and he said to himself as he traveled along, This sure is an easy road, nothing like the rough furrows behind my father's plow. Young man, smooth and easy is the road that leads to hell and destruction. Downgrade all the way. The further you travel, the faster you go. No need to trudge and sweat and toil. Just slip and slide till you bang up against hell's iron gate. And the younger son kept traveling along till at night he came to a city. And the city was bright in the nighttime like day. The streets all crowded with people, brass bands and string bands a-playing, and everywhere the young man turned, there was singing and laughing and dancing, and he stopped a passerby and said, Tell me, what city is this? And the passerby laughed and said, Don't you know? This is Babylon, that great city, Babylon. Come on, my friend, and go along with me. And the young man joined the crowd. Young man, you're never lonesome in Babylon. You can always join a crowd in Babylon. Young man, you can never be alone in Babylon, alone with your Jesus in Babylon. You can never find a lonesome place to go down on your knees and talk with your God in Babylon. You're always in a crowd in Babylon. And the young man went with his newfound friend and bought himself some new brand new clothes and spent his days in the drinking dens, swallowing the fires of hell. And he spent his nights in the gambling dens, throwing dice with the devil for his soul. And he met up with the women of Babylon. Oh, the women of Babylon. Dressed in yellow and purple and scarlet, loaded with rings and earrings and bracelets, their lips like a honeycomb dripping with honey, perfumed and sweet-smelling like a jasmine flower. And the jasmine smell of the Babylon women got in his nostrils and went to his head, and he wasted his substance in riotous living in the evening, in the black and dark of night, with the sweet sinning women of Babylon. And they stripped him of his money, and they stripped him of his clothes, and they left him broke and ragged in the streets of Babylon. Then the young man joined another crowd, the beggars and lepers of Babylon. And he went to feeding swine, and he was hungrier than the hogs. He got down on his belly in the mire and mud and ate the husks with the hogs. And not a hog was too low to turn up his nose at the man in the mire of Babylon. Then the young man came to himself. He came to himself and said, In my Father's house are many mansions. Every servant in his house has bread to eat. Every servant in his house has a place to sleep. I will arise and go to my father. And his father saw him far off, and he ran up the road to meet him. He put clean clothes upon his back and a golden chain around his neck. He made a feast and killed the fatted calf and invited the neighbors in. Oh, the sinner, when you're mingling with the crowd in Babylon, drinking the wine of Babylon, running with the women of Babylon, you forget about God and you laugh at death. Today, you've got the strength of a bull in your neck and the strength of a bear in your arms. But some of these days, you'll have a hand-to-hand struggle with bony death, and death is bound to win. Young man, come away from Babylon, that hell border city of Babylon. Leave the dancing and gambling of Babylon, the wine and whiskey of Babylon, the hot-mouthed women of Babylon. Fall down on your knees and say in your heart, I will arise and go to my Father. Friends, when God foils your plans, when God slaps down your hand from grasping at his power, at his position, at his godness, it's a mercy. He's loving you by confounding you. He's loving you by confusing you. He's loving you by not condemning you in that moment. And like James Weldon Johnson said, your arms are too short to box with God. So what's the answer? You submit to God, and you call out to God, and you worship God. It is your role on this planet to worship God, not to create him. And the story of Genesis 11 is that human history will be defined by little pieces of dirt flexing their muscles at Yahweh their maker, boasting in the delusion that they'll win. And they won't. The headline is coming, Babylon falls. The Lamb wins. And the very fact that this is written down on pages for you and me to read is a plea to run from that city. Don't stay in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar repented of the Babylon of his heart and said, I am not God. God is God. Friend, you are not God. You do not determine your fate. Your life is not in your hands. Your days are numbered and they're known. And your Maker, while you may writhe in bitterness against him because he hasn't given you everything you think he should give you. My life isn't going according to plan. I'm not satisfied in what I want to be satisfied with. What gives God? Is he confounding you? Is he slapping your hand down? It's a mercy because he loves you. And he's calling you to run from Babylon. I want us to close our eyes and close in prayer. But as we pray, as your eyes are closed, some of you here, your life is still Nebuchadnezzar. You're sitting on your own throne, boasting in your own little kingdom. And my prayer is that you would turn from grasping at Godness and you would submit to God. You're never going to build your way up to heaven. You're never going to overtake him. But he's calling you to join him, to switch teams, and to find mercy. Father, you and you alone are God. We are not. You and you alone are the creator of heaven and earth. Your dominion is an everlasting dominion. Your kingdom endures from generation to generation. And all of us, every inhabitant of this earth, is accounted as nothing as you do all according to your will. And no one can stop your hand and say to you, what have you done? For you are God and we are not. Lord, I pray for anyone who's sitting on the throne of arrogance, that they would turn to you in humble submission, that they would cry out, Lord, forgive me from my sin, forgive me for my rebellion, that they would put their faith and trust in Jesus, who's a gracious and kind Savior, who has come to rescue us from ourselves, and that tonight they would find freedom. They would find freedom in knowing you and loving you and being loved by you. And they would be rescued from the bondage to the delusion of self-exaltation. I pray this in the name of Christ, your gracious Son. Amen.